Hi, I'm Deanna Springer.
And I'm Dana Casey with a fun Stitch It Sisters sewing technique and classic time-saving tips by Nancy Zieman.
First, let's take a look at the technique we're featuring today. We'll be stitching quilt binding with Riley Blake Designs Shades fabrics, a 1/4 inch quilting presser foot, an edge joining presser foot, size 75 Schmetz chrome quilting machine needles, Clover's Wonder Clips, Clover's Stiletto Awl, Clover's Seams Right, a little fusible tape, and our Bernina B770 sewing machine.
The last step in making a quilt is adding the binding. Try Nancy Zieman's absolute easiest binding technique for great results.
To add binding to our quilt, we'll first choose the fabrics we'll be using for our quilt binding. And we've selected Riley Blake Shades. And we have 3 different fabrics on the board because we're showing options for quilt binding.
Okay.
And the first thing we need to do is measure our quilt. And it can be an estimate too. And we can measure each side, and we know that this quilt is a mod mini, so I think it's about 16 inches. So we want to make sure we have about 4 crosswise fabric strips cut from our fat quarters. It's okay to use fat quarters or the full width of the fabric.
Okay.
And 4 will do it, but let's add 1 more. So let's add 12 to 18 inches more for this technique because we'll be overlapping our binding for our absolute easiest binding technique. So let's take a look at the fabrics. We do have an additional fabric here in yellow, and that's for our rod pocket. If you want a rod pocket on your quilt to hang your quilt, this is when you need to add it. So we'll start by talking about the rod pocket first. We'll take a rectangle of fabric and we'll press under. You want to make sure that the rectangle of fabric is no wider than your quilt, and you want it at least 6 to 9 inches long, depending on the size of your rod that you'll be putting through the pocket. And then we do some folding. We use the hot hammer or hot ruler, and we press under a 1/4 inch and a second 1/4 inch. And then we do the little top stitching. We top stitch right along those edges, and we fold it up and press. And that's our rod pocket. So you can see the finished rod pocket on the back of our Mod Mini. It's ready to go. So let's take a look at the unfinished quilt that I have here. This has been all straight line machine quilted, and we did some horizontal quilting on this version. And this is when we'd add the rod pocket. Just center that in the center and do a little pinning and pin that rod pocket into place. So we can pin that into place, and we'll just simulate that that's our stitching line. You can base that right in the center top of your quilt, and then it's out of the way. And just make sure that it doesn't get in the way when you're doing your binding. So this isn't binding, but an important step. This is where you add your rod pocket. That way it's enclosed in the binding seam, and there's just a little bit of hand stitching to stitch that in place.
Okay.
The next thing we'll do, we talked about, is cutting our crosswise fabric strips. So you can use a fat quarter, or you can use crosswise fabric strips, which we have underneath. This is our No Hassle Triangles ruler. And we use it to make no hassle triangles, half squares, and 1/4 squares. To make 2.5 inch quilt blocks, we have a marking that says cut your fabric at 2.5 inches. Great news, that's the same dimension as quilt binding. So I use our No Hassle Triangles ruler to cut quilt binding. Quilt binding is cut with 2.5 inch strips. So cut your strips, your 2.5 inch strips, as many as you need to go around your quilt, plus that 18 inches, remember. And underneath our fat quarter are crosswise fabric strips that we've already cut. And you see we have a couple different colors here. You could make your binding all one color, but there are no rules with quilt binding. With our art quilt, we can bring our art quilt back. You can see some garnet binding and purple binding, and we just seamed together some fat quarter crosswise strips to make this binding. So that's what we'll show today. We need to seam all of our crosswise fabric strips into one continuous strip. So we'll start by placing 2 strips right sides together. So you place them about a 1/2 inch offset, and you have 1 strip horizontal and 1 vertical, and you would stitch. You'd stitch a diagonal line right here. So I'm just pinning that. We're simulating the stitching. But you can see that V and that V that is created by crossing the strips. Once you stitch that line and press that open, you have continuous strips.
Okay.
And you want that seam on the diagonal to eliminate bulk. But we'll stitch all our strips together continuously, press those open, and trim the seam allowance to 1/4 of an inch. So the way we created multicolor binding was to sew every other strip together.
Sure.
And we only used fat quarters. So the strips were about, 18 inches long.
Okay.
And it created that fun, playful, colorful binding. And that's what we have on the board. The next step would be to press. We'd press that strip, that continuous strip together. Place it wrong sides together and press. And then you have that continuous bias strip. And it's not bias, it's binding. It's a binding strip,
Okay.
but it creates quilt binding even though it's not bias. This sample shows that we've already seamed it together, and you can see the multiple colors that we have going on with this binding. Once we've pressed wrong sides together, we need to cut one end at a diagonal. And we do that so that we can sandwich the end binding into this area. And we'll show you that at the sewing machine in a little bit. But we want to put a little fusible tape here. So we have Clover's fusible tape, and we've just added that 1/4 inch wide by about 2 inches long, 2.5 inches long. And we fuse that at the ironing board, fuse that into place,
Okay.
just on one end. The other end of the binding is still straight. So we'll start by placing this on the unfinished quilt on this side. So I'll bring that quilt back. And remember, our rod pocket is back there. We want to make sure we don't catch that in the seam. And then you want to stitch this onto the quilt. And you place it, a classic time-saving tip by my long-time friend Nancy, place that quilt binding beginning and ending in an area that's a little busy on the quilt. So
Okay.
if you did it down here, it'd be more conspicuous. Place it in an area where it'll kind of blend in. But with this binding, it's really not going to matter.
And it's sort of offset, not like directly on the corner.
It's offset. Don't start on a corner, correct. That's a good pointer. Don't start directly on the corner. When we stitch this to our quilt, we'll begin in from the edge. So you would think maybe we'll stitch that right at the end of the quilt. You'll stitch that binding right there, but we're not. We need to leave that loose. So go in about
Okay.
6 or 8 inches from the edge. And I like to give myself a lot of room for this step. You'll see in a little bit when we insert the other end into this. It's nice to
okay.
have a little bit of room. So about 6 inches in, we'll stitch. We'll go to the sewing machine and we'll stitch. And we'll stop when we're near the corner. And that's where the seams right comes into play. And we have Clover's white marking pen. And we need to stop. And we'll stop at 1/4 inch from the edge and from the edge of the quilt. So we mark that dot. It's 1/4 inch from the edge and 1/4 inch from the top. And that's where we'll stop stitching. And you'll use Clover's stiletto. And it'll help us fold the fabric just the way we need it to be folded. But we want a nice tuck corner. So we actually fold fabric at the same plane as the top of the quilt or the next intersection. So stitch 1/4 inch to the corner and then back stitch.
Oh, okay.
Fold your binding away from the quilt, but on the same plane as the next edge. And then you fold the binding back over, and you have a nice miter corner. It's under there. It will be revealed later. But that's when you go back, put it back under your sewing machine presser foot, and start here and back stitch, and then stitch forward. And it's the same process. We repeat all of those steps on every corner. And soon we'll head to the sewing machine and we'll show you that technique at the sewing machine. To attach our quilt binding to our quilt, we'll start by aligning the cut edges of the binding to the cut edge of the quilt. And remember, we're going to start stitching about 6 inches in. So I have a pin right about where we'll start. 6 to 8 inches in gives you enough room to attach that binding once we get all the way around the quilt.
Okay.
Now I've attached a 1/4 inch presser foot to my sewing machine, and we're engaging the dual feed. Now's the perfect time to use your dual feed on your sewing machine when you're working with so many layers. It keeps the layers from shifting.
Okay.
We'll start stitching again about 6 inches in from that edge. We'll stop stitching when we get close to that corner, and I'm using a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I want to mark a scant 1/4 inch dot. Again, a 1/4 inch from the edge and a 1/4 inch from the side. So I'm just using my seams right to mark that dot. Okay. And that'll be my stop stitching dot. So I'll stitch to that dot. And then I'll back stitch. I'm back stitching away from that dot, and I'll cut my thread. And you'll see that the binding is stitched along that side seam, and I've stopped that 1/4 inch from the edge. The next step to do is to fold your binding, and look how that miter naturally forms at that corner. When I fold that binding up in line on the same plane with the next edge of my quilt, it naturally forms that 45-degree angle. And this is where I like to use Clover's stiletto, and that helps me fold. So I fold the binding over, and I'll hand that binding to you. I'll fold that binding over. We're keeping that 45-degree fold in there, naturally folded that way, and I'll align the cut edges of the binding with the cut edges of the quilt. So it's aligned. And now we don't have to worry about that 1/4 inch. We'll actually start 2 inches in from the edge.
Okay.
So I'll use my knee lift, and I'll start 1 inch or so in from the edge. And what I do is I start back stitching. And I back stitch to the edge of the quilt, and then I go forward. And that secures that corner and that miter. That's in there. It's hiding underneath there right now.
Okay.
So we'll do the same thing. We'll stitch. We'll stitch to the next corner. And as I near that corner, that's when I make that mark again. I get my white marking pen and my seams right, and I mark a 1/4 inch in from the edge and a 1/4 inch from the side. And then we'll stitch to that mark. I drop the needle into that marked point, and then I reverse. I reverse my stitch and cut my stitches. You get the idea.
I do.
We're going to remove it from the machine, and we're going to fold that binding up on that same plane as the next seam we're sewing, the next edge. And then I fold it back over. And you don't want that too generous, so that's why I like to use the stiletto. It's thinner than my finger, and it keeps that nice and folded when I'm ready to stitch. So just insert that stiletto and insert it back into your machine. Turn the corner, start about 1 inch in from the edge, align your cut edges of the bias. It's not bias, of the quilt binding. Align that cut edges of the quilt binding with the cut edge of the quilt. And drop that presser foot, and then we're going to back up. So back up and then stitch forward. So we have another corner. We're at the 3rd corner, so we'll have another review. Mark that 1/4 inch dot. I'll grab my pen. Mark. And the seams right works great for that. It has just a little bit of a 1/4 inch corner on it. 1/4 inch in, 1/4 inch up, and that's our stop stitching point. We'll stitch to that mark. We'll drop our needle, we'll back up, we'll cut our threads.
And it's important to backstitch there to lock you in.
You could cut your thread. A lot of people cut their thread and just they're done.
Okay.
I like to backstitch everything I do. I don't want things coming apart, so I like to backstitch away and then just cut the thread.
Okay.
And then again, we fold. We fold it up at the same plane as the next edge. We get our stiletto and we fold it back over. And just align it with the cut edge of the quilt, and we go back under the sewing machine. We turn the quilt, we start about 1 inch in We use our knee lift to drop, and then we back up. We reverse stitch, and then we go forward. We're nearing that
One
fourth
more.
corner. We'll take, seams right, we'll mark our 1/4 inch in, 1/4 inch up and in, and then we'll stitch to that point. Back away from the corner and cut the threads. Fourth corner, so fourth fold. Fold up and away from the quilt. Get your stiletto and fold over and align that with the next cut edge. Turn the corner and we'll backstitch. We'll backstitch to that corner. You could start stitching at the very edge, but that's when you'd want to have an anchor cloth so
Sure.
that the machine could easily go from one fabric to the next. If you start an inch or so in and then sew backwards, you don't have to have that anchor cloth.
Okay.
Now don't be tempted to sew this entire seam. This is when we need to stop stitching and cut our threads. And this is where the magic of Nancy's technique comes into play. This is the original, the beginning seam, and I stitched a little too far, so I'll just pull it out a little bit. You want to stop stitching about an inch or two before that binding.
Okay.
So I'll cut that free. I stitched a little too far. So that beginning edge is here, and then we remove that paper backing from that fusible web. Thank you. And we simply insert the end of the binding into that opening, and then we cut. We trim this away. So make sure you have enough room that you trim that away. You don't want to cut your binding too short
Right.
and have it revealed. But that's fusible web tape. So we know we can now go to the pressing mat and we can press this. And you have your iron and you just align the cut edges and make sure that it's tucked into place there and press. And you can press that. And if you had metallic threads or decorative threads, you'd want to use a press cloth.
Oh,
but
for
you
sure.
can press that and make sure that that's stuck. We can do a little bit more and press that into place. Great, thank you.
That's not only here, it's up here
It's
as
underneath,
well.
so you have to
Okay.
heat that up a little bit. And that holds it into place. The method we used before this was to mark that seam and to turn it inside out on itself and sew that seam. So we developed
okay.
a new method, Nancy's method, of stitching that with fusible tape. We put it back under our sewing machine, and I'll put my needle up, and we'll stitch. We'll stitch that scant 1/4 inch seam. And we'll cut the threads, and then we'll do a little pressing. First, we should do a little trimming. You don't want that bulk in here, so we'll trim that away. We'll trim that away down to our scant 1/4 inch, that extra fabric.
Okay.
And then we do more pressing. We bring that back to the pressing pad and we press. We press the binding open. So we're pressing that seam open because the next step will be to wrap that binding to the back. So you'll press, you don't really need to get into the corners,
Okay.
but you'll press all the way around those edges. And once you've pressed those seams open, then we can wrap them to the back. So we wrap that binding to the back and we use Wonder Clips. And you can wrap this to the back and Wonder Clip all the way around, or you can Wonder Clip as you go. So we'll put that back under the sewing machine and we'll stitch, but we need to change our presser feet.
Okay.
We'll stitch in the ditch and we'll change our foot to the edge stitching foot. So it has a little guide on it that will guide us right down the channel of that binding. And you can do a little bit more fussy folding than I am today. But we'll put that back under the sewing machine and we'll stitch in the ditch or the well of that seam where the binding meets the quilt.
Okay.
And the foot keeps you on track. And the same thing when we get to the corners, we'll unfold that front
Okay.
that we had folded, and there's that miter. It magically formed just by using that method. And we'll fold that corner, and I just like to hold it with my fingers as I'm approaching the corner. You could go around and wonder clip every corner and get that all ready, or you could just stitch on the go and stitch in the ditch and attach that binding. So we'll start by stitching that binding, and we're top stitching it. And this is a classic time-saving tip from Nancy. Use monofilament thread. This is a seam that is going to attach the binding to the quilt. It's not necessarily a decorative.
Okay.
So you can hide those threads, those stitches by using monofilament thread. So I'm nearing that corner. I want to fussy fold that. I'm turning it up and I'm looking at the back. And I'm making that miter. I'm making that miter corner right at the back of the seam to match the front. And then I just hold that as I'm stitching. And I stop. I drop with the needle down, lift the presser foot and turn. Now I know I have my rod pocket back here, so I want to move that and make sure that it's out of the way. And we'll turn the corner and we'll fold, and that one didn't catch, so I'm going to back up and then refold that and catch that in the seam. And you can use your stiletto for this too. Your fingers can't really get close to the needle. And then drop the needle, rotate the quilt, and turn the corner. And again, wonder clip your binding to the back. That's what wonder clips were designed for quilt binding.
Oh, that's cool.
And then stitch. We're using wonder clips for their invented use. We'll advance the wonder clip, and we'll do a little fussy folding at the corner, and we'll stitch. And you're stitching on the quilt. You're not stitching on the binding. You could do it either way. You could top stitch the binding on, but you're going through less layers if you stitch it directly to the quilt. So again, I'm fussy folding that corner so that it has a miter on the back to match the front, and I'm just holding that as I approach the corner. Stop with my needle down, raise my presser foot with a knee lift, and turn the corner. Again, wrap that binding to the back and wonder clip. And make sure that you're wrapping all the way to the back, because that stitching is catching the binding on the back as well as attaching it. Wrapping that corner and folding and stitching. We have 2 more corners, so we'll fold this one under and round that corner. The same treatment for all 4 sides and all 4 corners. And just do take a little time and fold that, and then stitch. And then you have a little miter on each corner. And that one moved, so I'm going to back up and catch it. And that's the nice thing. You could, with an invisible thread, the monofilament thread, you can back up. And I'll bring my stiletto in and hold that into place, and then stitch. Drop with your needle down, turn the corner, and repeat.
Repeat.
Realign that fabric. And you can use your wonder clips and stitch that in place. we're coming up to the final corner. Wrap, fussy fold, and stitch that binding into place. You could put a pin there too if you want to. I just like to pinch it. We'll round that corner and we're back at our original stitching line. Here's our thread. We'll just trim that thread. And that's where the OSD curved embroidery scissors would be nice. It's curved so that it clips those threads without clipping your quilt.
Oh, yes.
I just didn't have that handy right now. And turn the corner and stitch. And back stitch, and we're there. So we have matching quilts. You'll bring your quilt back.
I will.
And we have mitered corners on all 4 corners, and we've bound our quilt. And if you've missed any areas, you can just catch those with hand stitching, or you can put it back under the machine and stitch that. Quilt binding finishes off the edges of a quilted project and also adds a nice border of color.
This is definitely my new favorite method for adding binding. It truly is the absolute easiest way to bind quilts.
We hope you've enjoyed the Stitch It Sisters project. You'll find this pattern along with a limited number of bundle boxes at stitchitsisters.com.
Be sure to tune in again for another Stitch It Sisters sewing adventure.
In the meantime, connect with Stitch It Sisters and friends on our social sites. Stitch It Sisters is made possible by Bernina, Clover, Riley Blake Designs, OESD, Oklahoma Embroidery Supply and Design, and shopnzp.com.
Bernina, made to create.